Good morning for everyone joining online. Good afternoon, good evening, good very early morning. And welcome to Solutions House, which is a space created by Futera and Google and Exponential Roadmap. And I really want to extend a massively warm welcome to all of our fantastic speakers, our great audience here, and anyone joining online as well. Now, there is one rule at Solutions House, and that is it's answers only. So we will be extremely focused on the solutions. It's not to say the problems aren't significant, and of course sometimes you have to look at the problem in some detail to find the solution, but the focus here is solutions. That's what all the sessions are designed around. We've got a full week of programming, so we'll dig into this topic, greening cash, in just a moment. But please do keep an eye out for any of the other sessions that are running on till Friday, if you can make it to the bitter end. Now, this is not usually an event space, as you may be able to tell. It's a working space for Futera. So if you hear the odd ping from the elevator, or you may see the wonderful Dagada, Alice's dog, wandering around, that's why. If she gives it, if you feel a little lean on your ankle, that should be Tagada. Can't promise. Okay, so I'm Lucy Shea, and I am the CEO of Futera. And we are on a mission to make the Anthropocene awesome. And the way that we do that is logic and magic. So we are a strategic consultancy, and we work with our clients in this area, actually. So, for example, providing research and recommendations about how you can divest across your value chain. And that means looking at what your cash is doing in the bank, more on that in a moment, but also what your consultancies and your lawyers are doing. So this concept of serviced, and particularly for here, financed emissions, is crucially important in our fight to tackle climate change. At Futera, we are the first professional services agency to have climate solutions provider status as part of Race to Zero. And what that means is the work that we do, not just our operations, but the work that we do, our serviced emissions, is focused on climate solutions. So we only work on sustainability and equitable climate solutions. And that concept of serviced emissions is something that we've got to see popularised far and wide. That's why I was so pleased to see it adopted in part of the Race to Zero new interpretation guidance. Now, segue over to what we're going to be talking about today, which is financed emissions, another issue that really needs popularising and embedding into business culture and operations. And the guide that we're going to be looking at today, or the findings of, and this represents an enormous, it's the Greening Cash Guide, and it represents an enormous piece of work from Exponential Roadmap, but also a kind of a roundup, if you like, of some of the work that our panelists have been doing for a long time. So I'm really pleased to see this guide and the work that our panelists do getting a good outing at Climate Week and Solutions House this year. Now, it's based on the premise, this guide. Now, Johan, I'll pass to in a moment. He'll talk to you about it in a little more detail, and as with our speakers. But it's based on the premise that total carbon emissions of some companies in the services and ICT sectors could more than double if their emissions from their cash holdings in the bank were quantified. And I love this insight because it's a perspective and a new way of seeing things that can radically change how we work within the business sector to tackle climate change. So we're going to be really, it's an enormous opportunity to change, but the question is how you do it. And that's what we'll be digging into in this panel. Now, as someone said to me yesterday, oh, you've got all the doers over there at Solutions House. So that's who we've got today. We've got this panel of wonderful doers and thinkers, practitioners and thought leaders who are working in this sector. So they're going to bring us all of their insight on how you do it. And we will be, so we've got Johan Falk, who's the CEO of Exponential Roadmap. After Johan, we'll be going to Paul Moinester, who's the founder and executive director of Topo. Then to Allison Fajans-Turner, who's the managing director of BankFWD. And finally to Ingmar Rentzhog, who's the CEO and founder of We Don't Have Time. So I'll introduce everyone as we go into that. That's it from me. Johan, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Lucy. So excited to be here and on this session. And just on the guide, if you can take that. Just to highlight that it's a common work we've done together with Topo and Paul here and Allison. So it's really a common initiative, really radical collaboration. We developed it in a pretty short period of time. We think it's a really first good cornerstone to start to accelerate action in terms of greening cash. So I'm the CEO of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative. What we are doing, we're bringing together the leading transformers and disruptors taking action to halve emissions by 2030 through exponential climate action and solutions. So every project we do have an idea to scale exponentially, and this is one example of that. So, let's see. The foundation of this guide, from our perspective, is basically the 4-pillar model. So when we work with our companies, which represent a bit more than $1 trillion in revenue if you combine their revenue, they basically implement a strategy based on the 4 pillars, which is about cutting your own emissions, your value chain emissions, scaling climate solutions, and contributing to change in society, climate action in society. And to have a strategy in line with 1.5, you have a strategy across all these 4 pillars. So that is what the leaders are doing. And if you look at the value chain pillar, that's the second pillar, how you actually cut emissions in your value chain. If you would take into consideration your deposits in the bank, that can radically raise your scope 3 emissions. It's not taken into consideration today. And as you know, what we will recommend is that all companies start to disclose that emissions from your deposits. So more about that in a minute. So when we put deposits in our bank, whether we're a small corporation or a large corporation, the bank will lend this money out, and it can actually use it to lend to companies for green activities, which is good for transition activities, for lower emission activities, but also for high emission activities, even deforestation activities, and fossil fuel expansion activities, which is, as far as we see it, absolutely unacceptable in this moment in time when we are in a climate crisis, and we need to put a stop to that. We need to use the influence from the companies to actually make this shift within the financial sector. And as I mentioned, emissions from companies' cash are currently not measured or reported. And as we said, for many companies, that can even double the emissions. If we looked at our own small operation, that will add up about 100% on top of our scope 3 emissions. That is significant, which means that we need to act on it. That's why we launched the guide, which is the first step. But it goes further than actually bringing good advice to companies. It's actually about how can we ignite a virtuous circle of change. So if you think about it, if the corporations start to put requirements on their banks, the banks will take these requirements to their customers to put transition plans in place and to start cut emissions and so on, whereas the companies will put the pressure on the banks. So the key point is really to ignite this virtuous circle of change, which is the bigger exponential strategy. Let's stop there and hand over to Paul.
That's wonderful. And thank you for the reminder to everyone turn your cell phones off. Thank you for that. And just while I've got the floor for a moment, we'll be taking questions. So get your questions ready. Once we've had a run through of the guide, starting with Paul, we'll be taking questions online from the audience and also from the floor.
Yeah, and I'm just going to stand if that's okay. But so I'm here to sort of tell the origin story of how this solution started getting put on the map. And so in the spring of 2021, in the midst of the pandemic, we were spending a lot of time by ourselves, stuck at home, and very fun times. And so I would start reading sustainability reports of companies like Google and Netflix and others. Unfortunately, they were all coming out with these like big, very exciting new initiatives around cutting their emissions. And we'd been working on banking stuff and started asking, well, why is banking not in here? Where is banking? We know that banking matters. Bill McKibben would tell me, and I have basically no money, that where I bank matters. What does that mean for the richest companies in the world who have tens, if not $100+ billion in cash and investments? And if you could start factoring and sort of understanding with the emissions around that, could you calculate that, and what would that look like? And so our motivation for asking these questions was sort of based on 3 facts that we inherently knew. So fact number 1, if I'm making sure I'm getting this in order, is that the financial sector is on track to fund emissions well beyond our global climate goals. And so despite all of the wonderful work of politicians and organizations and activists around the world, we weren't transitioning nearly fast enough. And the third thing that we knew, or that we thought we knew, was that companies and organizations were largely sitting on the sidelines. They weren't working to activate their cash and investments as a lever for power, and considering that they were the largest consumers in the world, I'm sure Chase will listen to Google and Microsoft more than they'll listen to me. And so we started asking these questions, and here's what we found. And I'm going to actually go with answer 2 first. And I remember the first conversations, and we were very fortunate to be working with BankFWD and Climate Safe Lending Network on this, who are our foundational partners. And when James Vaccaro from Climate Safe Lending Network and I started talking about this, we were like, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about 3%, 5%? And he sort of did a quick back of the envelope math, and was like, I think we're talking about like 50%. And then my sort of mind got blown, and then we started really calculating all this, and we found out it was actually substantially higher than even that. And I will say a little sneak peek to friends in the crowd, which is that these are actually all underestimations. And so new data that we've been developing is showing that these numbers are likely going to come close to doubling in some cases, depending on cash and investments. But essentially what we found was that for the biggest companies in the world, Google, Microsoft, Apple, Salesforce, and others, that their cash and investments were one of their largest sources of emissions, if not their largest source of emissions, if not larger than all of their other emissions combined. And we had to leave PayPal off here, because for them it was actually 5,000%, because they have so much money and have done such a good job minimizing their carbon footprint. And so it sort of broke the curve. And then we started talking to companies, and we would go and we would talk to Microsoft and others and Apple, and we'd say, like, are you all working on this? What are you doing about it? And they basically said, what are you talking about? And that's not an indictment of them. They are brilliant, smart people. This is just the fact that this has been so far off the map for the longest time that no company, or very, very few companies and organizations, were actually really thinking about their banking and investing. And until, as far as we are aware, we started doing these calculations, no companies or organizations were even really aware of what the scale and scope of this challenge was. And so as we sort of move forward on all of this, we had this tremendous discovery, which is not just that this is an emission source, but for companies, for all companies, their climate objectives are being undermined by their banking and investing. Not just from an emission standpoint, but also from an investment standpoint. About 22% of all money banked in this country in the largest banks funds carbon-intensive sectors. That means if you put $1 billion in one of those bank accounts, over $200 million of that, when it's lent out, is lent out to fossil fuel industry and other carbon-intensive sectors that are driving climate change. And so the goal in all of this, essentially, is to get companies, organizations, and individuals to treat their banking and investing just like they do with everything else in their supply chains. Work to reduce those emissions, take control of it, engage with their banks, and really start thinking about how do we wrap our arms around this challenge, and how do we transform our cash and investments not from a climate detriment, but into our largest lever for climate progress. And so, partnership with all of these wonderful folks here, what we've really moved on to is not just discovering this challenge, but really working to build the tools, data, and solutions that will enable all companies and organizations to really start harnessing the power of this very overlooked emission source and really harnessing the power of it as a force for catalytic and systemic change. So happy to turn over to Allison now, who's going to walk through what all that looks like.
Thank you. And Allison, just before you start this is the danger of speaking to your audience rather than your speakers when you're doing the introduction. Just also to introduce Quinn, you're going to be talking after Allison. Thank you.
Oh, no.
Quinn Williams, who's Director of Actionable Bank Standards Program at the Beneficial State Foundation. Welcome. All right, Allison, next to you.
Fantastic, and thank you very much, Lucy, and thank you for introducing all of us here. So just to punctuate a few things that Johan and Paul were saying. One, we really need to start realizing that every company, but it's not just companies, every institution has a financial supply chain in addition to all of their material supply chains, and that they should actually be looking at the assets and the activities and the relationships and partners and vendors that they use along that supply chain, just as they would looking at their material supply chains and how can we start assessing and measuring the emissions that are being created through that material supply chain, and how can we start reducing that as well. So really that same logic applies to your financial supply chain. And what Paul just led us through is that the magnitude of the emissions created through the financial supply chain can be massive. It can really vary, and that's an important point. It also depends on what is the operational and what is the value chain footprint, the scope 3 additional footprint of a company that you're looking at. If a company has a major manufacturing base and footprint, then the uplift from its financial emissions might be smaller than if it's mostly a tech company that doesn't have a broad manufacturing footprint, in which case it has more cash relative to its operational operations and emissions, and therefore its financial footprint is going to be a larger sector of, or a larger percentage of its financial footprint. But when Topo and BankFWD and the Climate Safe Lending Network started talking to companies about this, we got a range of responses, but pretty much every company that was willing to engage with us was like, what are we supposed to do about this? And so, we've kind of illuminated the magnitude of the problem, but right now we're actually sitting in the solutions house. And as Lucy was saying, like here we have to be talking about what are the proactive steps that we can be taking. And what I will just say is that this is an emerging area, and what we have tried to do in this lovely guide here is create a starter set of solutions, but that because this is an emerging area, there's a lot more collective problem solving that all of us in this room are going to have to do on this issue as we move forward. So this guide, we set out kind of seven steps, and I will just see, there we go. And we've kind of broken them into foundational steps, kind of how do you get the baseline for the information you need to start tackling this problem. And so we've got kind of 3 steps there. And then once you've got that baseline, how do you actually start engaging with your banks to reduce your financed emissions? So what is your engagement and implementation strategy with the information that you've gathered? So the first step, basically an important piece of information about working on this issue is that this cannot stay siloed in the sustainability team of a company. Sustainability teams are really going to have to work with their finance and their treasury teams, and hopefully with top management, and hopefully get a signal from top management that the finance and treasury teams really have to be working very closely with their sustainability teams. And just before this panel, Johan and I were talking about the fact that this is a really important relationship and a really important inroad for sustainability teams to be engaging their finance and treasury teams more, Because ultimately, where we have to go with corporate sustainability is that it cannot be a siloed exercise within a company. It really has to become something that is mainstream throughout that company. So just working on the financial supply chain, it's going to be really important to be engaging your finance and your treasury team, but that is going to have payoffs for sustainability work writ large within your corporation, your corporate setting. The second is, how do you start gathering data from your bank that's going to help you assess where your bank sits in terms of its climate performance, and what might be the what might be the emissions footprint of your bank? This can be tricky because your bank is going to come back at you with a lot of answers that sound good but aren't actually going to illuminate that much. But we have tried to create some frameworks that hopefully can be helpful. So we've put together a pretty rudimentary checklist in the guide for questions that you can be asking your bank to start kind of assessing how serious your bank is about actually putting a credible net zero plan, and not just a net zero plan and target, but a transition plan to get to that target kind of on the map. It's tricky to kind of find that sweet spot between asking too many questions of your bank and asking the right number that will actually give you the information you need. So this is, and also how do you not overwhelm companies when you give them this guide, essentially. So there are only about 5 points here. If companies are interested, BankFWD and Topo have actually worked on a thicker set of questions that companies and really any institution can start asking their banks. The URL to that is in the guide. Happy to share it out as well. But it's good to, these are the kind of core questions to ask, and then we've got an extended set as well. So once you've kind of collected some information from your bank, then there was a third point in the foundation, which is deriving that first ever estimate of what your financed emissions are from your deposits. And that follows the methodology that Paul and that Topo, BankFWD, but Topo and the Climate Safe Lending Network really developed. So there are steps in here around that. And also, because this is an emerging area, and also there's a good amount of propriety around bank data and company data and such, that's something that we can also, if you contact us, we can help walk you through a little bit as well. But once you have that foundation, then you want to put your engagement strategy in place. And one of the most important things, steps you can take, is opening a climate conversation with your bank and just letting them know that you are concerned about this issue, that you won't take their greenwashing kind of responses as acceptable. And the more companies start doing this, the more banks are just going to have to start developing more credible responses to it. Then you can also start asking your bank to move your money into more sustainable, greener vehicles for investing and for lending and for your deposits. There's a note of caution here, though. There are not that many green deposit vehicles that actually exist right now, and some of the ones that are out there are not exactly robust at the moment. So just also beware that some banks retroactively apply the label of green deposits to the deposit allocation or the kind of retasking allocation of their finances instead of proactively moving or repurposing a client's deposits towards green lending. They might retroactively do that. So that's kind of where we are now. We have to move away from that. We need much more proactive retasking. And because we are in this place where the green vehicles within large global banks are not where they need to be, companies should also start looking at what can they do with their existing kind of book of business, can they move some of that money to smaller banks that are doing a better job on this, or that have much less carbon exposure in their portfolios? And we understand that banks can't do this with the majority of their funds, but they can start doing it with some of their funds. They can also look at, if it's a company that uses multiple banks, of the banks that they're using, which banks are performing best on climate within that selection? How can they shift more of their money into those existing accounts? And then also looking at, across the board, how can we shift most of our funding into slightly better banks? This might be a geographic solution, particularly for multinational companies, where European, EU, UK, New Zealand banks are much further ahead than Wall Street, large global banks on this issue. And then it's also really important for companies to not keep this stuff to themselves, but to actually publicize that they are taking these steps to decarbonize their financial supply chains. Share those learnings out with their networks, make that public on all of their digital and social media channels, and really let it be known that it's no longer tolerable for banks to be using their money the way that they have been. And with that, and sorry for the mouthful that was, I will now pass it over to Quinn.
Cool.
Wonderful.
All right, hello. So I'm Quinn with Beneficial State Foundation. And Beneficial State Foundation, BSF, is the nonprofit owner and founding investor of Beneficial State Bank. It's a $1 billion bank on the West Coast. And we do a lot of supporting the bank with their systems change, but we've also been shifting towards banking system change more generally. Like, how do we help banks internally to be this mechanism for change? There's a lot of stuff that banks actually have to do internally before they create like the products and services that are going to be offered to customers. And I run a team, before we get to that, I run a team of basically partners came to us about maybe 7 years ago and asked, like, what's a good bank? And the foundation our bank doesn't actually do like municipal bonds and all those sorts of things. So tell us what a good bank is. My work evolved from that in trying to create a measurable pathway for banks to actually like do this work. Social, I would say, transformation of communities. And we have 5 different categories for our standards. So it's governance. So how is the bank actually putting into its social impact what we're talking about, like its mission, its Articles of Confederation, and lending and investments in products and services. So how is it actually incorporating, how is it thinking about how it's serving its customers correctly? Is it training its staff, its front level staff, those sorts of things? And then corporate citizenship, which is its advocacy. And the last being its operational practices. So its footprint, right? Is it thinking about how its bank is actually, like, where is it geographically? Is it closing businesses in Black communities? Those sorts of things. And we have 3 levels to our standards as well in terms of, I would say, poor to better to best. But we want to say this is where you should start. It's a measurable pathway, right? We want to meet each bank where they are. Smaller banks, for sure, are going to be further in the journey. And bigger banks we'll talk about bigger banks later.
Spoiler alert.
Yes. But so we want to meet banks where they are. And a lot of what our work is similar to what Allison said, is trying how do we package it, right? Like, how do we package all of what we've created and put it in front of banks without being too overwhelming? And a part of that work is the standards revision that we'll be undertaking. So we have a council of 10 folks, 3 community organizations, 3 to 4 bankers, and then 3 standard setting organizations. And we're trying to talk to them about how do you actually, like, what should banks be doing and how do we get them to do it, essentially. And a lot of that work is, like, how do we create a governance, the actual standard setting processes in terms of what should the document actually look like, what do banks need to see? And then the third being implementation. So I think that's the media advocacy, public pressure, all those sorts of things that we're thinking about. as well. And I'll say before I pass it over, on a personal note, I focus more on social impact. I care about people. And I think it was 2020, 2021, I started realizing, all right, if climate activists are trying to remake the world, then we should remake it in an equitable way. So I joined Climate Safe Lending Network's, their fellowship, so their inaugural fellowship, about 20 bankers, climate bankers all around the world, where we sat and we're thinking, a lot of people were front of desk or side of desk, like how do I, in my position, get more activation from my leadership? Like, what do I do? And so we had a lot of those conversations in 2021, and now we're having a roundtable of 4 discussions around climate transition. So just transition, really. So I think we are on roundtable 4 of 4 different, all over the world, where we're trying to figure out how is climate action actually going to do it in an equitable way. And I am excited about what Green Cash is doing, because my team was thrilled, I think 2 weeks ago, because we know that banks respond to clients. We know that banks respond to consumer advocacy. And if clients are actually going to start trying to talk to their banks, we love it. So I'll just end with that.
Quinn, that has been the most wonderful roundup of your session. Thank you. And a great call out to everyone to download this guide, to use the guidance in this guide. It's quite short, this guide as well. It's very usable. So thank you, Quinn, and Ingmar, over to you.
Thank you. I must say that it feels extremely well to be here and talk about this important book. I will explain why it is very important for me. But first I would like to do a shout out. This book that is launched by Exponential Roadmap with partners, we are a small part of it as well. I think if I'm a bank, I will be scared as hell. It's thin, it looks not so important. But what it's going to do out there is going to counterbalance the fossil fuel industry. Because today, if you're a bank, and I'm used to work in the banking industry for 15 years before I founded We Don't Have Time, you have like the sustainability people, they want to do good. And you have the business people that bring in the profit. And today, no banks say no to do something good for the climate, to find new business opportunity. But if they risk to lose profit from lending out to the fossil fuel industry, they will not do that today. Because in the bank, you have all the people doing business, they will shout out, if we are doing too much climate, we're going to lose that and that client. So they stay with those clients. But what this book will do, it will counterbalance that. Because suddenly, the bank will have to choose, either they're getting very unfriendly with non-fossil fuel companies that will ask a lot of tough questions and threaten to withdraw their money in the bank if they do not change, or they need to stick with the fossil fuel industry. And everyone knows that the fossil fuel industry will be the losing side. It's maybe the most profitable thing to do today, but not tomorrow. So this book will change that. And I think that's why this is going to be so important. But the only thing that is standing in the way, I will say, is that we need this book to get out there. And out to as many businesses as possible, but also out to the public, so that we get a public pressure behind big companies to pressure the banks. And we need to get everyone on board with this. And that is what I'm doing. I'm CEO of a company called We Don't Have Time, and it's the world's largest climate solutions network. And it's an app, so you can download this on App Store. And what you can do is that you can look up a bank and see what other people active in the climate solution space are thinking of that bank. Some are getting a lot of climate love, that's good. Some are getting a lot of climate warning, that is not so good. So this is a great app for amplify good climate action. So when you're using this guide and when you find a bank that are doing the right thing, you could give climate love and We Don't Have Time to amplify that. And I would also like to say something else. And you said this, that it's amazing how much emission that just are in the money. And that's not just for companies, it's also for our private individual. Our pension savings is probably the most impact we can do. And it just takes a couple of minutes to swap a bank. So it's so easy. But it's even more than that. Because I think that we should not only focus on the emission. The emission is not really the problem. We have all the solutions. We know that we're going to lower the emission. We just need to speed it up. So the big question is not why, it's not just only focus on the emission. The big question is how can we speed things up? And in order to answer that question, we need to answer the question, why is it going so slow? And I will say the fossil fuel industry is making everything they can to slow down progress. In lobbying, in politics, in public, they're doing everything to slow down progress, exactly like the tobacco industry did to slow down regulation of smoking. So when you are withdrawing money from the fossil into the green solution, you're actually starving the power that are resisting change. And that's even more important. So this is maybe the most important book in a long time.
All right, thank you, panelists. Thanks for that rousing call out for why this book's so important, Ingmar. Okay, so we've got a few questions coming in online, and I'm gonna. We've got some questions that we had already thought that we might like to discuss and look at. So we got those, but actually our panelists have done such a good job that I feel that some of these have been semi-answered already. So I think we've had a little bit on kind of what might your bank say when you start talking to them in this area. So I might jump over that one. I would love to ask you, and it is in line with a question from. We'll be taking some questions from the floor in a moment as well. And in fact, can I have a little semi-show of hands just to see if anyone is burning to ask a question? Okay, good. All right, good. So we'll come around to you in just a moment. Good. Just wanted to know that before I went. Okay, so online, thank you, Ariel Chaffetz, and I hope I haven't mispronounced your name too badly. Two questions. And the first one is, what incentives, financial or otherwise, do institutions have to change banks from a carbon-intensive one to a less carbon-intensive one? And if I may, I'd like to put a rider on that question as well. Quinn, you talked about don't get started on the big banks. And Ingmar, you talked about the pace of change. As part of this question, where do we need to be focusing our attention? And it's okay if the answer is both. Is it on moving the big banks to less carbon intensive, or is it about supporting the smaller banks, the more the born goods, who have that more at their heart? So if I could ask you, and we might pop when you're hot, so incentives to change banks, but also should we be decarbonising the big banks or growing up the more less carbon intensive small banks?
Yes, I'll start with the second question first.
Yep.
So I look at it both, of course, but with the small banks, it's definitely smaller organizations should be working with smaller banks. Like you should actually be working with an organization that's going to care about what you have to say as a company. And we need case studies. Bigger banks in general, they move in a herd. They're very terrified of going outside of the herd unless they've done really, really bad things before. So key bank, like there are certain banks that we know they start to do very, very good things when they get called out for doing very, very terrible things. So big banks, when they do bad things, we have to public pressure, period. And I would say those are the two different ways, I would say, for the first. And financial incentives. What is the financial incentive for banks to change?
Or actually for the company to move from a higher intensive one to a lower carbon one.
Oh yeah, well, changing your bank is the same thing from the individual standpoint. You get better customer service, higher interest rates, those sorts of things. Make banks work for you, right? They are doing a lot of, and we're writing about this, but banks are doing a lot of telling their customers on the client and the personal side, oh, like you should look at your treasury notes. You should look at your cash spending. they should too.
Great. Allison, and then I'll go to Johan. Thank you, Quinn.
I'll just add on to that a little bit and say that it pays for companies to try to align their banking with their other climate and social values. So with their values set. So if a company is actually spending a portion of its money investing or giving in charity to climate causes or environmental causes or any cause really, but the vast majority of its money that it deposits in a bank is actually going towards activities that counteract that giving, that's not a very efficient use of its funding, right? And more than that, a lot of companies have been, like there's a lot of credit due to companies that have been working really hard to bring their emissions down, that have been working really hard to set robust, ambitious net zero plans and transition plans to get to those net zero plans. Unfortunately, it turns out that their money that they deposit in a large global bank is actually working against all of that work that they're doing on their other supply chains. So it undercuts their own net zero planning and progress, essentially, if they keep banking in the status quo way with large global banks.
Yeah, do you want to go and pick up on that?
Well, our theory of change in all other industries is very much that to really transform an industry, you need both disruptors, which in this case could be the smaller banks, but you also need what we call transformers. So we need big banks to actually go in the front line as outliers who can actually take a position. So I think that's incredibly important because it's difficult maybe to move from a big bank to a small bank as a company. So we need a couple of big banks who's breaking out from the pack, and we can actually show that it's really profitable for these banks to break out and actually put in place good, sound strategies. So I think that's our role as well. We will identify these actors and highlight them. So it's not only to push on the bad ones, it's actually to try to lift up the good ones, which I think is important. Yeah.
And one other small point, and I totally agree with everything that's been said. And at this time, disclosing these emissions, working to reduce these emissions is a voluntary activity. Just a shout out, 7th Generation, which is in the crowd, I believe is the first company to actually publish their finance emissions, and Lush and others who are here are leading the way on the next sort of frontier of companies that are really embracing this and working to push. And they're doing that because they know it's the right thing to do. But what we're expect to see in the near future is that this becomes part of the mandatory reporting framework. And so now is the time to get ahead, and we expect in the near future, whether it's through B-Lab or GHG protocol, or SBTI, all of our wonderful frameworks that we have, there's a very good chance that this will start becoming an accepted best practice or a required practice.
Right. Did you want to come in, Mark?
Yeah, just add something there. And it's more than those voluntarily emission reporting. Now, European Union will make it mandatory for all mid-sized company to publish emission data, exactly like it is for financial data. And I just read the other day that California will join them. Yep. So things are moving there. Financial emission is not there yet.
Yes.
But let's lobby for that.
It's happening.
And I just want to add, we need those small players to challenge the big banks, but we also need a big bank challenge the other big banks, like we had seen in the car industry. Yeah. I mean, we have electric cars 40 years ago, but until Tesla did it for real, nothing changed. But now, I mean, who will buy a combustion engine car, right? No one. It's just history, it's going down. So this is going to happen in finance. But the good news here is it takes a lot of time to build up a new car brand. It doesn't take a long time to build up a global bank that is fossil-free.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I love that we're getting some celebrating the solutions here as well. Thank you for that, Paul. Now, we've got some questions. We've got a few questions, and I will come to you, but gentleman at the back, you, I think, raised your hand in the last round. I also noticed that you picked Tagada up. I thought that was a very good, effective, I'm here, I've got a question, I've got the dog. So, do we have a roving mic? Oh, good. And it's in your hand, please.
Yeah, I've been trying to learn about PR, so I feel like that was one way. So we have talked a lot today about the banks themselves and the demand for more sustainable use of cash. Now, can you talk a little bit about the actual supply side of the pipeline of green projects and how scalable that is? Because an example would be, if you look at renewable energy project financing in the last few years, the return in that market has completely been collapsed because of the enormous amount of money chasing projects, but that pipeline just can't keep up. Mm-hmm. So how do we make sure that doesn't happen in that market going forward, and also in the other markets that requires climate solutions?
Yeah. Great.
And also, a lot of the green solutions today are not, let's say, proven. They don't have a proven financial model. Now, how do banks and financial institutions deal with that when, in fact, they're just their whole business is arbitrage, right? So if they can't make the risk model work, they can't make the return work, how do we expect them to be able to, I guess, put the money into a more green use?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. Now, I'm going to ask, we'll take a maximum of 2 responses, because we've got a few questions coming.
Yeah.
Paul?
I'll try to be, it's a huge question, it's a critically important one. I'll try to be as succinct as possible. Yes, you are, so there's sort of 2 problems here, which is one, some of the biggest banks, I think last year the data shifted a little bit because of the war in Ukraine, but in 2021, like Chase, I believe it was like $63 billion that they lent out to the fossil fuel industry. If you went to Chase today and they said, great, we're done with that, we need to move that $63 billion, the pipeline is a problem. But at the same time, like, what do we know? We know that the largest banks and asset managers and insurance companies in the world have $22 trillion of exposure to the carbon-intensive sectors. And we know that we need to be investing trillions of dollars a year in all of these green solutions, from decarbonizing businesses to greening infrastructure to sort of retrofitting the entire automobile industry. And so what we know is that there needs to be a sort of Cambrian explosion of green financial products, because the traditional lending of how you finance fossil fuels doesn't necessarily apply to how you finance the green transition from a time horizon. Doesn't mean you get less return, it just means that there's sort of a larger time horizon and there's other inherent problems in place. And so what we know needs to happen is, as companies go and talk to their banks, there's trillions of dollars to be made on this, and it just is requiring a level of innovation that's not there right now because there's complacency sort of around the current model.
Great. Ingmar, yes, sorry. Did you want to go back in this as well, Quinn?
Yeah, but, sorry.
No, advocates have to actually tell banks to start looking at changing how they see a good product. It has to be a longer time horizon, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah. Great. Okay, briefly, Ingmar.
Sorry, I can be very quick. I think it's a really good question. And I think we need to look beyond banks here in order to really solve that problem. The reason why renewables are not killing the competition is not because renewables is profitable. It's because the fossil fuel subsidies, the governments are sponsoring the fossil fuel industry with up to $7 trillion according to IMF. And that's nowhere near what's happening with subsidies for the clean energy. So we need to also address that problem in order to get to the root cause.
I think we're all paying about £1,000 a year in subsidies if you break it down. Okay, we've got some, just on the positive, on the solutions, I found out the other day, you may all know this, but this was a good factoid for me. I found that there is at least one exchange-traded fund which is set up on avoided emissions. Did you know this? Yeah. So a fund, avoided emissions being building the solutions economy, ETF set up in order to put money into that. I haven't checked out the methodology, but I thought that was rather exciting. All right, we had 2 more questions. So yes, just behind you, the lady in the blue top. And then I know I've got a couple more coming. I will come to you.
Hi. Thank you so much for all of your work and just the incredible innovations that hopefully we'll be taking away from here. I want to talk about the rating systems, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, the FDIC, because they overemphasize the stability of assets, which by default then means that when we go to our corporate executives and say we want to change banks, and they say, well, you can't have anything below a AA rating or an A rating. And a lot of the green options or regional options might be in that A+ to B area because of their, what's perceived as an instability of their asset class and in the long term. So the question, two parts. One is, how do we start attacking or encouraging the rating system agencies to either reassess how they weigh assets in the rating system, whether that means they include a new category of rating or adjust their asset classes. And then second, how do we take this argument that AAA and AA doesn't always mean the best to our corporate executive leadership?
Allison, did you want to come in, or should I?
I can address part of that, and I think that as we really push for climate risk disclosure from banks and from other publicly traded institutions, that is going to show that a lot of these vehicles that have been set up, that have been given high ratings, are actually carrying a lot of risk that we have previously not known about. And that hopefully should make rating agencies rethink how they are establishing their rating credentials and quality. So that is something that we absolutely need to start happening on a more massive scale than it has been.
Totally. Paul?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I appreciate the very sort of technical questions that are being asked today. It's a very informed audience, but maybe it was just because
Climate Week.
Yeah, right. Maybe it's just because I watched The Big Short recently again, but rating agencies have a tremendous history of assessing risk appropriately in this country. I say that tongue-in-cheek a bit to say that we need to rethink what risk says, as Ali mentioned, and what risk looks like. And the best example that I'll give, and this is sort of a non sequitur to your question, which is we haven't talked about insurance, which is also part of your financial supply chain. And you would think, who does a better job of understanding risk than the insurance industry? But what we're seeing on the insurance industry side is a few things, which is one, where there is very obvious high risk in places like Florida and California. Insurance companies are pulling out their services, and they're leaving their customers sort of stranded. But meanwhile, they continue to insure offshore drilling and Arctic drilling and all of this other stuff, and they're using their profits that they're making to invest back in the fossil fuel industry itself. And so they're sort of winning on both sides of the equation, which is that they're frankly screwing over the customer and continuing to drive climate change and make money all at the same time. And so that's really not a solution, so apologies. But I think it underscores this larger point that we need to reassess how we think about risk, and that these industries haven't been forced or pushed by their consumers to really think more strategically about what that risk looks like.
That's fab. I know that there's more answers on this, but in a very solutions mindset. I think we've got a couple more questions. I would love to see if we could get those answered, and still give you all a bit of time for networking. So if we could take a couple of questions in a row, and then that will be it from the floor. I know you had a question, and I know you had a question. If we've got the mic over there, thank you. Yeah, here. And if you could keep it, well, not that brief, but to the point, and then we'll go to you, and we'll answer both of those at the same time.
Right. Thank you, Amanda Ellis. Lots of light bulb moments for me. I'm an ex-commercial banker and a world banker. So I wanted to ask a question. This point about subsidies is a huge one, given we know that if we took them away, by 2030, we would have a 34% drop in emissions, which is pretty close to the 43% we need. So such an important point, which brings me to the legislative frameworks that you raised. So we're from New Zealand. We're first country in the world, woman CEO of the Treasury, to actually mandate financial climate disclosures. So very exciting to hear that a small country can have an impact. We're seeing that happening in California and the EU, as you said. What role might that play in creating change in the financial industry? Because we are seeing it. Carmen's business, for example, does generate zero, and the banks are using her product. It gives cheaper mortgages to the consumer. because there's lower risk. So if we could see that kind of race to the top, so I'd love to hear that on legislative frameworks. And now that we have RJ Banger and the World Bank, what role might multilateral development banks play in that race to the top? Final, Johan, who are the banks that are doing good stuff? Are you going to call them out?
All right, we've got 3 in 1 there. If we could just take the mic over. Here, please. Sorry, thank you. I hope you've logged those questions. I shall remember them as well. Yes, please.
This question about moving from operational climate accounting to equity-based is critical. And you mentioned the driver of consumer demand, right? But that's difficult because you have to educate a lot of people and it moves pretty slowly. So I'm curious, what are some of the other drivers, and what do you see as kind of a time frame for this becoming, widely accepted in the time that we have?
All right. So we'll take the question first on mandatory disclosure, role of countries driving change. Anyone would like to take that? Yes, please, Ingmar.
I think this mandatory disclosure are key, and because we're talking finance here. Imagine the finance industry without regulation and mandatory financial reporting. It will be impossible to do business. So we need to copy that to sustainability and climate. And someone needs to go first. And those that are doing it, let's shine the light and give climate love to that. So I think that's important. But I would like to add something. It's not enough with mandatory reporting. We also need transparency and get that information available to everyone. Today, if you go to Google and you Google almost all companies and you search for their revenue, you instantly find a number. But if you Google about their emission, you don't find anything.
Yeah.
So that is something we on the time actually working. We're going to publish those numbers for free and make it indexable.
So that is part an answer to the other drivers. I think, Quinn, I saw you making a note. Did you want to come back?
Yes, the 2 drivers that I know that we're thinking about are, of course, regulators. So FDIC actually trying to figure out how to bring regulators in some of these conversations about better underwriting. And the second is with the consumer advocacy groups, right? I would love companies to actually figure out how they can work with some of these sorts of groups and support collectively.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you. Paul, do you want to take a final point?
Waving goodbye to somebody.
Okay.
But, it's very misleading. No, I think, I just want to say, sort of to bridge the gap, because I think it's really great that Quinn is here talking about all of this today. And I have a tendency to sort of overly index on climate, and we talked about this because we can measure it. But the equity piece of this is really important, and we have to be thinking about both. And when we talk about banks transitioning, we have to be thinking about a just transition from banks in terms of what do we do to ensure that, like, as I sort of noted earlier, if you just took all the money out of fossil fuels as much as that needs to happen from a climate perspective, how do you ensure that you're not stranding customers behind, and how do you ensure that you're not stranding a workforce behind, and how do you do this in a way where you're really sort of putting equity up front and center to all of that? And so we're really excited to be working with Quinn to sort of build out a lot of similar resources to this apparently book that's going to save the world. So thank you for that. Why did we not put that on the back cover, Johan? I think we missed it. But to really think about it too, from how do you look at this through an equity lens? How do you engage your bank around the equity part? How do you put the equity into the regulatory part of all of that? Because it is harder to measure and it is sort of harder to put your finger on, but it's critically important in all of this.
We're going to take that as the answer to the subsidies piece. Thank you very much. Allison, if I could come to you for a final brief point, and Johan, I'll go to you and then we'll close. Allison.
I would just say that on the kind of legislative framework piece, we also really have to make sure that the full scope of emissions from all categories is being included in what is being asked to be disclosed. So right now in the US, we are expecting a rule to come out from the Securities and Exchange Commission, and it's taken a very long time to get here. And part of what is holding up that release is, will it just cover scope 1 and 2, or will it also cover scope 3? And it's really, really important that it covers scope 3. And there are a lot of geographies that are way ahead of us on this. New Zealand being one, amazing, keep it up. Share out those lessons learned. It sounds like it's also really starting to get the banks to pay attention and actually comply fantastic. It's good for banks to know that this can be done. And the EU. The new rules from the EU are huge. The rule coming out of California just now is huge and precedent setting for the US particularly. So we know this is starting to happen. So the kind of idea that we don't know how to do this, so we can't do it yet, or we can't do it on a bit large scale, or we don't have all the answers figured out on scope 3, isn't actually a viable excuse anymore. So we need this federally, and we need it to be all scopes.
Fabulous. I kind of need to stop the session, but Johan, do you want to do a 5-second?
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're setting up this as an action track. So this world's most important book in the world is just a starting point, of course. It's just a starting point. We need to bring together some of the leading companies' CFOs, because it's the CFOs that has to implement it. We'll work with the pioneers. We will not work with the laggards. They're not invited. Only with the front runners, because you will always have institutions which will try to delay transformation. And we need to implement it, and we will make it. We will move forward. So it's great if you can join us.
Yeah.
It's starting point.
Yes, come join. Thank you so much. All right, so the recording of this session will be available on the Solutions House YouTube channel. Please use the hashtags Solutions House 2023 and Climate Week NYWC when you share content. Thank you so much. Please, a warm thanks to the wonderful panel.